Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, we've been studying Sutta number 22 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is the Alagaddupama Sutta, the discourse on the simile of the snake. And just to review briefly, the sutta begins when there's a monk by the name of Arittha who has been going around propounding the view that according to his understanding of the Dharmma, those things that are called obstructions by the Buddha are not really able to obstruct one who engages in them. And from the tone of what he's saying, as well as from the way the monks understand it, what Arittha is really referring to are sensual pleasures, especially sexual enjoyment. So what he's saying, in effect, is that for one, especially for an ordained monk, to indulge in sexual relationships would not be an obstruction for him, even though the Buddha, this is page 224, even though the Buddha has said many times that in different ways that sensual pleasures are obstructions, and he illustrated their obstructive nature with a number of similes, which are just simply enumerated on page 224, and then again and again on the following pages. And then they're elaborated, these similes, in Sutta number 54 of the Majjhima Nikāya. Okay, so finally, when the monks can't persuade this monk Arittha to change his view, they report this to the Buddha calls him up, and then the Buddha reproaches him for propagating this wrong view. Then the Buddha illustrates how the Buddha also follows up on this by pointing to a kind of underlying motive of Arittha. It's not only to undermine the Buddha's teaching on sensual pleasures in order to open the door for the monks to go out, on a Saturday night, to go out on the town and enjoy themselves. But he also, it seems, has this disposition to propagate these provocative views in order to engage in debates. He's the type of person who likes to make provocative statements to get others to defend the so-called orthodox position. Then he'll start picking out little sayings from suttas here and there, or from personal observations, and saying that this disproves the mainstream or orthodox position. Like in the case of Arittha, according to the commentary, Arittha had observed that lay disciples who can still have sexual relations with their spouses are able to achieve at least the first and second stages of realization, the stage of stream entry and once returning. And so he's arguing that, well, if lay people can do it, why shouldn't monks be able to do it? So we don't need this rule of celibacy. Let's have maybe a married clergy, or even, we don't even need the formality of marriage, just monks can engage, can form open relationships And they can still practice and achieve the stages of enlightenment. So then the Buddha points out how there are some people in his teaching who learn the Dhamma not in order to realize the proper goal of the teaching, but in order to engage in arguments with others. And then the Buddha compares this to a man who goes searching for a snake, and then he grabs the snake by the wrong part of the body, by the middle or by the tail, and so the snake turns around and bites his arm, bites his leg, and then the man might die or become seriously ill because of the snake bite. And in contrast, the Buddha says that those who properly follow the Dhamma learn the teaching in order to realize the true meaning and goal of the teaching. And so when they rightly grasp or rightly learn the Dhamma, then the Dhamma will lead to their welfare and happiness. This is like the man who needs the snake, and then he goes, when he finds the snake, he knows how to grab it in the right place. He uses this forked stick to hold the snake down by the neck, and then he grabs the snake by the neck, puts it in a bottle or in a leather bag, and disposes of it. I told you about this monk in Sri Lanka, an elder monk who is well known for his ability to catch snakes. Even hundreds of snakes he caught in his life as the abbot of a monastery, till he died at the age of 87 or so. Do you know how he died? How? Gotcha. Pneumonia. I was waiting for somebody to fall into that trap. Okay, and then the Buddha next follows us up with the famous simile of the raft. Again, it's like a man who comes, he's in danger on this shore, he wants to cross a lake or a river and get to the other shore, and so there's no boat, no bridge, and so what he does is to get a number of sticks, logs, reeds, and he builds a raft. Now, the man who understands the purpose of the raft, the man who doesn't understand the purpose of the raft, after getting to the other shore, he takes the raft, puts it on his head, puts it on his back, and then walks around carrying the raft. But the person who knows the proper use of the raft uses it to cross the river or the lake. When he gets on the other side, he puts the raft aside and goes walking on his way. And so this illustrates those who first learn the Dhamma just in order to store up a lot of conceptual knowledge, to argue and debate with others, but don't apply the Dhamma to their own practice, for their own practice. The thing is, the simile is a little defective in that usually crossing the lake or crossing the river means getting beyond samsara, reaching nibbana. But the person who really reaches nibbana just naturally won't carry the Dhamma around as a means for just conceptual knowledge, debating, and maybe showing off his learning. So to maybe correct the simile, I mean, I don't like to be correcting the Buddha, but the way to apply it would be the person who binds the raft and doesn't even cross the river, but still staying on this side, he thinks, what a lovely raft I've made. Then he goes carrying it around, showing it to other people. You see how skillful I am in making rafts. And then the wild animal has been chasing him, catches up to him, the tiger or the crocodile, and catches him and eats him. But the wise person is one who uses the Dhamma to get across the lake or river, uses the Dhamma to get across the river of samsara, and then he'll still make use of the Dhamma for teaching others, but he doesn't just carry the Dhamma around as a body of conceptual knowledge to debate or to show off to others. Okay, so then the last paragraph that we took last week or 2 weeks ago was paragraph 14. The Buddha says, when you know the Dhamma to be similar to a raft, you should abandon even the teachings. So maybe we should sort of modify this to say, you should abandon even clinging or grasping the teachings. How much more should you abandon things that are contrary to the teachings, things which are not proper Dhamma? Okay, now there are two main outgrowths of basic ignorance. Two outgrowths of ignorance that keep us in bondage to the cycle of birth and death. One of these outgrowths of ignorance is craving, clinging, grasping. In this case, it could be the way the sutta begins, the craving for sensual pleasures and clinging to one's views about sensual pleasures. And then the other outgrowth of ignorance is clinging to views, especially the view of a self. And so in the Buddha's teaching, this is the fundamental, say, wrong view or mistaken, distorted view, the view of a self. So in the first part of the sutta, the Buddha deals with the craving for sensual pleasures. And now starting with paragraph 15, he's going to deal with these views that center around the notion of some kind of substantial, persistent self at the core of our being. And so he begins this section by saying that there are these 6 standpoints for views. And he does this by explicating the wrong views of self in terms of the 5 aggregates. But there's a little variation that we'll come across. Normally, the 5 aggregates are material form or physical form, that's the substance of the body, feeling, perception, volitional formations or volitional activities, and consciousness. But here, for some reason, we'll see that some substitution is made for consciousness. But let's go on and see how the Buddha explains this. First, he takes what is called the asuttava putujana. This is what's translated as the untaught ordinary person, the uninstructed person of the world, the person who doesn't have any knowledge of the Buddha's teaching or doesn't have a proper understanding of the teaching and hasn't made a commitment to the practice of the teaching. So this is described as the untaught, ordinary person who has no regard for the noble ones, for the enlightened persons like the Buddha, the great disciples, the arahants, and so on, who is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma. He's unskilled in that he doesn't really have a clear knowledge or insight into the Dhamma, and undisciplined in that he hasn't undertaken the practice of the Dhamma. So somebody could be like a very learned, knowledgeable, erudite Buddhist scholar even. So read many Buddhist texts, maybe write articles and books on Buddhism. But you could still say unskilled and undisciplined in the Dhamma if one doesn't have a clear view of the teaching and isn't engaged in the proper practice. And somebody could be a very simple person, maybe who just knows maybe one text like Dhammapada or a few suttas. But if that person can clearly grasp the point of the teaching and takes up the practice, we can say that this person is skilled and disciplined in the Dhamma. Okay, so this person regards material form, the body, thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. So he takes the body to be mine, to be what I am, to be myself. And according to the way the commentary explains this phrase, to take the body as being mine, this shows, you could say, the work or the activity, the operation of craving. Because it's through craving that we grasp things as being mine. Sort of the function of craving is to keep on, expanding the range of our possessions, our acquisitions. So I like this microphone, even though I don't have any use for it when I'm in my room, but I think this is mine. Somebody has a nice pen, I don't have it, I think, I want that to be mine. Okay, then the idea, this I am, means sometimes that seems to be a kind of view also, but the commentary, maybe for the sake of neatness, says that this is the function of, we call this conceit. It's the basic conceit is the idea, I am. And then when that conceit arises, we grasp this idea, I am, and we start comparing. How do I rate in relation to others? What is my ranking? In the class we have a list of students. How are they ranking? Are they top of the class, middle of the class, bottom of the class? So how am I doing in relation to others? Like, maybe I have such an income level, so I'm upper class, so I go around very smug, self-satisfied, dress in... Is Brooks Brothers still selling suits? I haven't heard this since I was in college. So, is it considered a high-quality suit still? So dress up in Brooks Brothers suits, have a Rolex watch, is it? And whenever I have to fly someplace, I always get first-class ticket. So that's the sense superiority. If I have just the middle-level conceit, just satisfied to be part of the crowd, then I can just dress casually, get a cheap, ordinary watch, travel economy class. You're traveling business class or economy class? Next time we have to get you a first class ticket. So then we just have the middle level conceit. And if we have I'm just dressed shabbily and don't even travel by plane, but I have to take the train or the bus, and I don't even have a watch, but I always have to be looking in shops to find out what the time is. That's the kind of, we call the low or inferiority conceit. So this I am, just a poor guy, no real special credentials, nothing special. Okay, then this is myself. This is taken to be the work of speculative views, where one is actually framing a kind of theoretical construct about the self. So some people do this in regard to bodily form. That becomes the focus of their attention. So maybe these are the people who are, the women are very concerned with their makeup, their figure, their diet, whether men are looking at them. And the men are the ones who are working out, lifting weights, going to the gym, keeping trim, keeping fit, keeping in shape. Maybe if the hair gets gray, they put on the blackener, the dye. Okay, so that's from bodily identification. Then some people fixate on feelings. They take feeling, this is mine, again craving, this I am, this is myself. Maybe this is the kind of aesthetic person who is, or maybe the hedonist, the person who delights in pleasure. Then there comes the person who fixates on perception. This is mine, this I am, this is myself. Maybe this will be the aesthetic person, the person who maybe delights in beautiful scenery, in works of art, the painter, the musician, or it could even be the thinker, the one who fabricates systems of ideas. Then come what are here called formations. This is in Pali, the word is sankhara, which really means it's based on the root, the verbal root, karoti, or the root is actually kar, to do or to make. So we get sankhara. So it's based on a word which means to make, to do, or to act. And so the sankharas are those factors of mind responsible for action or activity. Especially the early suttas point out intention or volition as the main factor among the sankharas. And so now I translate the word as volitional activities. I think it's more meaningful, more accurate than formations. Okay, so this would be perhaps the object of fixation of, we call this the person of action, maybe business executive, military people, person who establishes a company, wants to build up his company, the statesman, politician, the person who's always concerned with doing things. Okay, then comes, normally, as I said, the fifth aggregate is consciousness, vijnana, the basic, the way I understand vijnana, that it's the basic awareness that arises based on one of the 5 or 6 sense faculties, sense bases, which illuminates, lights up the particular objective domain that's accessible to that sense base, to that sense faculty. But in this sutta, for some reason, it's not so fully clear to me why this is done. But instead of you showing the aggregate of consciousness directly and explicitly, the aggregate of consciousness is shown indirectly by way of its objects. So he says, he regards what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, encountered, sought, mentally pondered thus. This is mine, this I am, this is myself. And according to the commentary, what is seen is the visible object, and that is supposed to be pointing to eye consciousness, visual consciousness. What is heard is, of course, sound, and that is pointing to ear consciousness. What is sensed refers to the other three physical sense objects: smells, tastes, and tactile sensations. And so that term points to nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and bodily consciousness. And then what is cognized, encountered, sought, and mentally pondered, that points to the mind consciousness, or the reflective consciousness, ideational consciousness, the consciousness that works not with external objects, but with the inner objects of the mind. And just this morning I was wondering, is this substitution for the aggregate of consciousness peculiar to the Pali version, or is it preserved in other versions of the sutta? So I checked the ancient Chinese translation, and it's the same as this. So it must go back to a very old period. But the reason for this, it's not very clear, but this is the way the text has come down. Maybe one of you will have some ideas about this. Okay, now the sixth standpoint for views is a view itself. And this is the full-fledged, full-blown eternalist view, the view of an eternal self. And so this is expressed in this way. That which is the self is the world. After death, I shall be permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. I shall endure as long as eternity. This too he regards thus: this is mine, this I am, this is myself. I have to say, it seems strange to me that he would regard a view as being myself. It would seem to me sufficient simply to say that this view is the standpoint for views. But anyway, what is this view? It seems to be a form in which the dominant view in the Upanishads had come down or been transmitted to East India, where the Buddha was teaching. The Upanishads must have originated in Western India, Northwest India, which was the strongest center of the Vedic civilization. And then that view of the Upanishads would have been sort of transmitted over time and reached East India in this form, which is not really exactly the way it comes in the Upanishads. But here, what is taken to be the real essence of the self is identified with the world. And then it's held that after death, but it shouldn't be after the death of any person, but it should be after the death of the enlightened person, that self of his remains permanently, everlasting, eternally in its own essence, without ever undergoing birth and death again. Okay, so these are the 6 standpoints for views in the way they are held to by the uninstructed worldly person or the untaught ordinary person. Then the Buddha, in paragraph 16, he gives the contrary of this. This is the way the instructed noble disciple relates to the 5 aggregates and to this view. So the well-taught noble disciple who has regard for noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their Dharma and so on, regards material form thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So this is a way, you could say, this is a way of contemplation. It's not just an idea, not just a theory, but it's a lens. Maybe that's a good expression. It's a lens through which the noble disciple regards or contemplates the 5 aggregates, using this viewpoint that this is not mine. So when you contemplate the body, not mine, this releases that clinging to the body. So when the body grows old, falls sick, even when death approaches, because one is not clinging to the body as mine, one is able to let go and to pass on peacefully. One views the body, this I am not the body. The body is not myself. So just as this cup, of course if I take the cup to be mine and it breaks, then I get angry or sad. But normally if I have this cup, if it drops to the ground and breaks, then I just think, okay, well, if it's a beautiful cup like this, I don't think, okay. But suppose it's just a plain, ordinary cup. Then if it falls and breaks, then I think, okay, that's the nature of the cup, is to break. And so with the body, when it deteriorates and breaks up, I'm able to let it go. Similarly, with feeling, not mine, not I, not myself. Perception, not mine, not I, not myself. Volitional activities, not mine, not I, not myself. And then the aggregate of consciousness, explained as what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, not mine, not I, not myself. So one uses this 3-pronged formula as a way of examining the 5 aggregates. And so with all of them, one detaches from them, so that one could observe them almost objectively. And even that which is doing the observation also one subjects to the same type of lens, even that mind, that consciousness which is observing the other aggregates, that also is just part of the 5 aggregates, which is also not mine, not I, not myself. And so in this way, one is able, by using this formula of non-self, one is able to let go of these things that constitute our being, our empirical personal identity. So if you're caught speeding on the highway and the policeman says, pull over to the side, and he says, what is your identity? You tell, well, my teacher told me, not mine, not I, not myself. Okay, so those are the 5. And then comes, the way it's expressed here, the standpoint for views. This too, he regards, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. What would be more meaningful or more sensible to me would be to simply say, he does not take up that standpoint for views, that which is the self is the world, after death I shall be permanent, everlasting, just like, and shall endure as long as eternity. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions on what we've covered so far before we go on. Yeah, Richard? Maybe do we have the floating microphone? Okay. I think it's not on yet.
In this list that's substituted for consciousness, what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, encountered, and sought.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about encountered and sought, because sought looks to me like it should fit under volitional formations. And encountered looks to me like it should fit under material form. So I'm wondering, why are those two thrown in there?
Good question. But we always come across those words as part of a fixed formula in different contexts. So quite possibly this was a formula in circulation during the Buddha's time, which the Buddha is just picking up and using, not something that he's himself formulated as something original. Perhaps. Otherwise, I don't really have an explanation for that. Okay, Evan, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I would just say you could see the word sought there. He's talking about that which is sought. He's not referring to the seeking. So the volition which is sought. Sorry?
Yeah, I understand.
So he's referring to the object.
Isn't seeking something a volitional activity?
But this isn't talking about seeking. He's talking about that which is sought, the object of seeking.
Yeah, so we could also say the object of seeking isn't consciousness.
It's for consciousness.
Excuse me?
It stands in for consciousness.
Yeah, it's a little. I have to say it's a little strange, and I don't fully understand the use of that formula there instead of the aggregate of consciousness. What the reason is? Perhaps. Do you have some idea about that?
I do, actually.
Yeah.
He could be splitting up consciousness like that in order to emphasize to Arittha and the rest of the bhikkhus that the opinions and views that form when you ponder the Dharma must be let go of, as Arittha has developed this idea.
Yeah, that could be a good idea. Yeah. That those are like his views are based on what is seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. So. Okay, let me take some internet questions. Okay, what is the difference between perception and thought? Okay, now thought is not explicitly mentioned within the five aggregates, but let us say that the function of perception is to select qualities of the object, to focus in on qualities of the object, and then to form, you could say, basic ideas, concepts, notions about the object. And then what we call thought, which in Pali would be the two mental factors, vitakka and vichara, is the way we turn the object over in the mind and bring up original ideas about the object and connect our perceptions into a network or system of ideas. So thought is a more sophisticated, more complex activity which builds up on the foundation of perception. Perception is more rudimentary, whereas thought is more complex, more cognitively sophisticated. Okay, then, is the delusion, this is myself, mainly about the desire for total control, the control-freakish nature of conceit. I don't think the idea of this is myself is necessarily about the desire for total control. It's, the way I see it, expresses more the desire to find some kind of basis for one's sense of personal identity. Okay, third question. Are the sankharas, here translated as volitions rather than formations, also about past conditioning, habits, and the tendency to make choices in thought, speech, and action? Yeah, I would say sankharas partly are past conditioning, habits, and tendencies, but also it's the present activities, the choices themselves and the way we express our choices in bodily action, speech, and thought. The fourth question is consciousness described in the Nikayas as having two aspects. One, the dynamic doer with the tendency to the outflows, the asava, and second aspect, the static knower. I would say normally consciousness is aligned more with the knowing and the awareness, and the doing. Of course, the mind functions as a whole with many constituents, but the doing is more the function of the sankharas. But of course, this takes place within the field of consciousness. Since when we act or do something, normally we know we're aware of what we're doing. Take the floating microphone.
Mindfulness.
Yeah.
An aspect of consciousness.
An aspect of consciousness. You see, within the early texts, there are many other mental factors which are not specifically assigned to the framework of the five aggregates. But later, say in the period of the Abhidhamma, then attempts are made to fit all the mental factors into the five aggregates. So what happens is that the fourth aggregate, the aggregate of volitional activities, is treated as a kind of umbrella category. So all of the other mental factors, except feeling, perception, and consciousness, are put into the sankharas. And so mindfulness, the wholesome factors, like mindfulness, loving kindness, generosity, wisdom, go into the sankhara aggregate, and also the unwholesome mental factors like greed, hatred, ignorance, worry, envy, jealousy, conceit. All of those go into the aggregate of volitional activities. Okay, unless there's any urgent question, we should go on. Okay, now, coming back to page 230, paragraph 17, the Buddha says about the noble disciple, the instructed disciple, since he regards these things thus, he is not agitated about what is non-existent. And the text here uses an important word, a significant word, which seems to have two connotations in the discourses. Okay, this is a little complicated to explain. Okay. The verb that comes, that's translated is agitated, is paritasati. And this seems to be related, you see, pari is a prefix. And then the root of this in Sanskrit is trish. And so the Sanskrit form of the verb would be paritrishyate. And from this you could see that it's closely related to the noun trishna, which means that's the Sanskrit for craving, which in Pali becomes tanha. And so one sense of the word paritasati, probably the older, more original sense, is to crave. So it's simply the verb that goes with the noun tanha, craving. But there's another verb in Pali, tasati, which means to be afraid. And so somehow the verb paritasati got mixed together with the verb tasati, which means to be afraid. And so the verb paritasati came to take on two meanings. One is the older meaning of to crave, and then another meaning, which is to be afraid, or to be anxious, to be fearful. And so when I was working on this, I was trying to find, I don't remember what word Venerable Nyanamoli used for this, but I was trying to find one word that can cover both aspects, craving and fear. And so I settled on agitation, to be agitated. Okay, so here the Buddha says he is not agitated about what is non-existent. And by what is non-existent, the Buddha seems to be referring to this eternal self or permanent self. Okay, now when the Buddha says this, then one monk asked the Buddha, can there be agitation? We could understand craving and anxiety or fear about what is non-existent externally. And the Buddha says that there can be, and he gives the example of someone who thinks of something that he had, alas, I had it, but I have it no more. There's something one possessed, but now one has it no more. Like if one loses one's job, one thinks, before I had the job, now I don't have it. People lose nowadays losing their homes. I used to have it, I have it no more. So this kind of sorrow comes up and grief. And then also we have yearnings and longings for things that we fail to get. So one thinks, alas, may I get it, may I have it, but I don't get it. And so when one thinks in this way, then the text says one sorrows, grieves, and laments, one weeps, beating the breast, and one becomes distraught. One gets into a state of bewilderment and confusion. So that is how there can be agitation about what is non-existent externally, what one had and lost, and what one wants but doesn't get. Then the monk asks, can there be no agitation about what is non-existent externally? And then the Buddha just takes basically the same example, but in the case of somebody who doesn't think in this way. So this is somebody who just accepts whatever he obtains and doesn't yearn and long for what he doesn't obtain. So in that case, this person doesn't sorrow, grieve, weep, and so forth. Okay, then the monk asks, can there be agitation about what is non-existent internally? Okay, this is the more interesting case. So the Buddha says there can be, and he says here, somebody has the view, that is the view of the permanent self, that which is the self is the world, after death I shall be permanent, everlasting, eternal. Then he hears the Buddha, the Tathagata, or the Buddha's disciple, teaching the Dhamma for the elimination of all standpoints for the view of self, the elimination of all decisions, it's not such a good word maybe, for all, let's say, commitments to the view of self, all obsessions with the idea of self, all adherences to a view of self, all underlying tendencies to the ideas of I, mine, and myself, for the stilling of all conditioned formations, for relinquishing of all attachments, for the destruction of craving, for dispassion, for cessation, for nibbana. Then he thinks, because he has this view of a permanent self, when he hears the Buddha teaching about giving up the view of self, cessation, dispassion, cessation, nibbana, he confuses that for a teaching of annihilation. He thinks, I have a self, and if I achieve enlightenment, it means myself is going to be annihilated. So he thinks, alas, I shall be annihilated, I shall perish, and this I, this self of mine, will cease to exist. And so he sorrows, grieves, laments, weeps, and becomes confused. Okay, then in the next case, the Buddha takes the instance of somebody who is without agitation about what is non-existent internally. So here somebody doesn't have this view of an eternal self, so he hears the Tathagata, or the disciple of a Tathagata, teaching the Dhamma for the elimination of all standpoints and so on, and he doesn't think, I shall be annihilated, I shall perish, I shall exist no more, and therefore he doesn't sorrow, grieve, and lament. So that is how there is no agitation about what is non-existent internally. Okay, now the Buddha is going to, I would say he's going to tackle these two. This is the interesting thing. In this passage we have two things. One would be possessions. And so when one doesn't get the possessions, then one becomes upset and miserable. And the other aspect is the view of self. And when one has the view of self, then when one hears about the Buddha teaching the Dhamma to eliminate all views of self, then one thinks, I'm going to be annihilated and destroyed, and so one becomes upset. And now the Buddha is going to elaborate on the same point in a somewhat different way, from a different angle. First, he speaks about possessions. Maybe we could say this passage is showing the wise attitude to take to these two ideas. One, the idea of possessions. The other is the idea of self. So beginning with possessions, the Buddha says, you may well acquire that possession which is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change, and that will endure for eternity. So if there is such a possession that will last forever, the Buddha says, go ahead and get it. So let's see what I want. Private plane, Prius hybrid, a nice house on the Riviera, another house in maybe southern Mexico, Mexican coast. What else would be nice to have? Diamond ring. So the Buddha's saying, I can get it. But wait a minute, he's saying that it has to be permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change. Now, how about the diamond will last forever. Really. But of course, the earth won't last forever, the solar system won't last forever, the Milky Way won't last forever. So do you see any such possession? And the monks say, no. So then the Buddha says, good, I also don't see anything any possession that will last forever. Okay, so here the Buddha is saying that from this point of view, you see all possessions as being impermanent, and thus you give them up, or give up the attachment to them. Then, coming to the idea of self, the Buddha says, you may well cling to that doctrine of a self that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who clings to it. But do you see any such doctrine of a self? And then the answer comes, no, Venerable Sir. The Buddha says, I too don't see any such doctrine of the self. Okay, then it seems in the third sentence here, the Buddha is just expanding the range of this more widely, maybe because he's here sort of indirectly or even directly criticizing the monk Arittha, who is adopting a view, not explicitly about the self, but it's a kind of distorted view. So the Buddha says, you may well take as a support that view which would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who takes it as a support. See, that's an important qualification. It's sort of leaning on the view, trying to get some kind of security out of that view. Let me just readjust this. Yeah, the Buddha also teaches taking up views, but the Buddha speaks about taking up right view and then using this not as something that one relies on as for a sense of identity or for a feeling of security, but one takes up right view in order to use it as a guide. As a guide to right understanding, especially the understanding that comes through insight. Okay, so the Buddha says that he doesn't see any support of views that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who takes it as a support. I think probably the implication is this word nisaya, which is translated as support. In fact, one does use right view as a support, but the implication of nisaya, the Pali word, is something that one is dependent on, that one is clinging to or attached to. Whereas using something as a support, in fact, the Buddha speaks about using right view as a support for crossing the flood, for crossing samsara. But again, it's using it as a support the way one uses the raft in order to cross the stream. Okay, then, now we come to paragraph 25. Again, the Buddha is going to be using or setting against one another these two ideas of self and what belongs to self. So he says, if there were a self, wouldn't there be that which belongs to self? So if I have a self, then I can say these five aggregates are mine. They belong to me. They belong to myself. So then the Buddha says, if there is what belongs to a self, wouldn't there be for me a self? If I say these five aggregates are really mine, then there must be a true I, a true self that owns or possesses the five aggregates. But then the Buddha says, since a self and what belongs to a self are not apprehended, not found, not discovered as things that are true and established. This is very important, the way the Buddha phrases this. He's not saying, since there is no self and nothing that belongs to self, which is like, he would say, almost like a metaphysical statement, but he's saying, he gives a kind of empirical flavor. He says, since the self and what belongs to a self are not found, not discovered as true and established. In other words, this is a kind of direction, a directive, instruction. Look for a self. Look for something you could say, this belongs to myself. But when we look, when we search, we don't find anything. What we find when we do the search is bodily form, feelings, perceptions, the mental factors or volitions, and the consciousness. And those don't have the qualities of a self. We'll see why in a moment. So the Buddha says and he says that these are not found as true and established. In other words, we could use them as conventions. Like I could say, this tape recorder is mine, so if you take it, like the woman in Copenhagen did, I told you about, then I say, she took my tape recorder, and by mistake I took her tape recorder. So we mixed up our respective tape recorders. So she had to send me mine, I had to send her what was really hers. But as true and established as something that's really mine in an ultimate sense, what's really true, what's really a self in an ultimate sense, not to be apprehended, not to be found. So then this standpoint for views, that which is the self is the world and so on, the Buddha says, doesn't this become an utterly and completely foolish teaching? And then the monks say, that is so. Okay, now the Buddha is going to direct the monks into a kind of insight, direct insight into selflessness. And he begins by taking the most evident of the three. Maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions on what has been covered in the above paragraphs. Okay, Richard. Is the floating microphone around?
25 looks to me like Hume's search for himself, which he finds okay, doesn't. But what he has is a bundle of perceptions. There's no self. But that seems to mean that the self is not an object of perception. Doesn't mean that it's not the subject of perception. Right?
It seems, that would seem to be a conclusion one might draw, except that the way this is treated in the Buddha's teaching is that that act of observation also has to be, in a way, scrutinized we call this reflexively. And so one sees that that act of observation itself has passed, to be followed by the next moment or occasion of observation. So instead of positing a lasting and enduring observer behind the observations, all one finds reflexively are acts of observation which have arisen and passed away.
So you find a serial observer.
Excuse me?
A serial observer.
Yeah, one could put it that way.
Okay.
Any further questions on this? Okay, Dina in the back.
Monte, I'm sorry. This is big. I think this is really big.
Okay.
And somehow I'm not getting it.
Okay.
Is it possible for you to apply this to a real person living in the world
Yeah.
that has a job, and has a house, and has children? And can you help me to understand this?
Okay.
And
I think the text is...
not as a monk.
Yeah, anyway, the text is going to go on and show the way that you say, the line of investigation that leads to the insight into non-self. That's going to come in what follows.
Thanks.
Okay, then there comes an internet question. Anyway, this gets a little complicated, so I'm just going to skip this question, because I want to try to finish in 10, 15 minutes to finish the sutta. Okay, so let us go into paragraph 26. Here we're going to see it's a kind of reasoning or logical investigation which is to lead into the understanding of non-self. So, non-self is actually the conclusion of a step-by-step investigation which begins with what is most evident, most clearest to an introspection, and that is the mark of impermanence. So the Buddha says, what do you think is material form or body, permanent or impermanent? Okay, it's impermanent. Okay, that is, an established fact of observation. Then comes a question, maybe a little difficult to get the point, is what is impermanent suffering or happiness? We can say is what is impermanent bound up with suffering or maybe subject to displeasure, to pain, to misery, or is it essentially bound up with happiness, bliss, pleasure? And then the answer comes again and again in the suttas that it's bound up with suffering. It doesn't mean that always the body is subject to suffering. I mean, people have blissful and joyful, enjoyable experiences through the body. But as long as there's bodily existence, one is subject to suffering. So when we really look closely into the nature of bodily existence, we see that because it's impermanent, whatever strength we have, our health, our vigor, our joys of the body are subject to change. They don't last. And so the bodily existence is bound up with suffering, and so looked at deeply and clearly, you could say it's flawed or defective, unsatisfactory. Okay, now, is what is impermanent, bound up with suffering, and subject to change, subject to deterioration, fit to be regarded thus, this is mine, this I am, this is myself? And the answer comes, no, Venerable Sir. Now, I think to understand this point really clearly, what's being driven at here, one has to say maybe something about the Indian understanding of the idea of what we call self, atta, or in Sanskrit, atma. Like in ordinary English, we use the word self simply to refer to our day-to-day identity. But in the Indian culture, at Indian civilization, at the time of the Buddha, the quest to find the self meant the quest to find what is permanent, eternal, everlasting. And so once one finds that something is, and that the self is, on the one hand, it's permanent and everlasting, and at the same time, it's a perennial source of bliss. The self is ever blissful, ever an eternal source of happiness and joy. And so once one finds that something is impermanent and that it's subject to suffering, then one sees that it is not to be taken as one's real self, one's real identity. And so then what is impermanent, changing, bound up with suffering is seen as not mine, not I, not myself. Okay, then the same inquiry is applied to feelings. We have feelings arise, pleasant feelings, painful feelings, neutral feelings, but the feeling arises and passes. It's impermanent. And even the pleasant feelings pass away, and when they pass away, they could be followed by painful feelings. Then perception. We can have pleasant perceptions, but those are impermanent. And every perception is changing. It arises, passes. The next one arises and passes. So we have what we call perception is actually a series of individual perceptions arising, disappearing, changing. Then we have the here called formations, but actually volitional activities. I do this, I want this, I behave in this way. I'm walking, the walking stops, I'm sitting. The sitting stops, I stand up. The standing stops, I sit down. The sitting stops, I lie down. So even the positions of the body are changing, and the volitions that determine what I do with the body always changing. And then the consciousness, the awareness of all this is also impermanent. This comes back to that point maybe that Richard made. Even the awareness, that light of consciousness that illuminates all of the objects is just a flickering, you could say a flickering of bursts of light which illuminate sometimes a visible form, then a sound, then it can be thoughts in my own mind, then again I might turn to something visible. So the consciousness is always changing. And so what is impermanent and changing, bound up with suffering, with painful experiences, this I don't want to identify with, this I can't take to be what I truly am. This is not that eternal, that everlasting self. And so the Buddha then says, paragraph 27, any kind of material form, whatever, past, present, or future, internal or external, far, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all material forms should be seen as it actually is with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And so on for feeling, perception, the volitional activities, and consciousness. So all of this should be seen with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So here we come to the very clear, all-comprehensive insight into the selfless nature of the five aggregates. We've proceeded from impermanence to the mark of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or suffering. Together, they point to the mark of non-self, selflessness. And the Buddha binds it all together by showing that all the five aggregates are not mine, not I, not myself. Then when one sees this, paragraph 28, the well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with form, material form. That is, normally we cherish the illusion or the perception, this body is mine, I, myself, feelings, perceptions, volitional activities, consciousness. We take them to be mine, I, and self. So those, we could say, are the illusions that bring this enchantment and clinging and delight in body, feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness. But now as the insight penetrates into the selfless nature of these five aggregates, there comes what is called in Pali nibbida, disenchantment. Five aggregates are not mine, but this is mine. Myself. Okay, so this is nibbida, which is disenchantment. Disenchantment with the five aggregates. Then paragraph 29, from disenchantment, he becomes dispassionate. So the noun here is viraga. That means the removal or ending of raga. Raga is attachment, craving, lust, but not only in the sense of sensual desire, but it's that desire for, clinging to, attachment to the five aggregates. And then through dispassion, the mind is liberated. It's liberated from the three outflows or the leaks of sensual craving, craving for continued becoming, continued existence, and the outflow of ignorance. And so when the mind is liberated, there comes the knowledge, it's liberated, and he understands birth is destroyed. That sounds a little strange. I now prefer to translate it, birth is finished. In other words, he's ended the cycle of rebirths. The holy life, the spiritual life has been lived, that is, he's completed the development of the Noble Eightfold Path, or of the three stages of virtuous conduct, samadhi, concentration, and wisdom. He's done what had to be done, completed the practice, And now there is no more coming back to any state of conditioned existence. So that is the end of the whole process of cultivation. Okay, I thought I would be able to finish the sutta today, but I see we're going to run into a third class on this. So I will end here. If there's any questions that can be answered briefly, we'll answer them now. If not, then just save them for next week or for the discussion period after the class. Okay, this is a question. Hindu, Brahmin, and other religious contemplatives also look for the self, but find it in the union with a creator God. The Buddhas come to a different, non-self conclusion by the methodology of looking for the self's non-existence, limited within the five aggregates. Let me save this for, it gets to be a real big, you said a brief question. It seems to be a very complicated question. So let me save this and try to answer it next week. Okay, I'm going to end the class now since I heard the gong for the lunch. Then we could continue the discussion after lunch, about 12 noon. And if anybody has other questions that come up, we could take them next week. I will finish the sutta, then we could have more discussion of it. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits, and I'm going to share a few other things besides merits after the class. So let us do the recitation. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva Shirang rakantu sasanam akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva Shirang rakantu desanam akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva Shirang rakantu mang parang Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya pavagupadhaya vichihetato etantare satakai upapanna rupi arupi cha sanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, so the next class will be next week. That's the April 24th, again with the half-hour meditation from 9:30 to 10, and then we finish the class from 10:10 till 11:30 or so. I wanted to mention that the Dwangyen Monastery will be having a kind of Dharma retreat the weekend. This will be April 30th, May 1st, and May 2nd. Starting April 30th, what time? That's a Thursday. Okay, so the registration is the evening of April 29th, and then it will take place all day on Friday, Saturday, and then I think the morning on Sunday. And then there will be lectures, classes, myself, and I think Venerable Dhamma-Dipa, the abbot, will give talks. There'll be meditations and instruction, and I think the monastic way of life. So you get to experience a little bit about what it's like to live as a monk or a nun in a monastery. Don't go running out the door, please. It's a lot of fun. And I said I was going to share a few things, because I get these catalogs, and if I can't use them, other people can. This is for the Omega Institute. It's about an hour north of here, upstate New York. Catalog. This is a cloth calendar for 2010. This is a calendar for UNICEF to purchase cards and gifts, and then the proceeds will go to help children, poor children. And a catalog for wisdom publications. And back in an older generation, Jewish people used to be well known as shoe salesmen. I'm from a Jewish family, and they must have found that out, so they're always sending me these catalogs for shoes. And I get one pair of shoes, I use it for 2 or 3 years. So anybody, in fact, I don't even think I opened this. Yeah, it's still sealed since I don't need shoes. But anybody is thinking to buy shoes, you can sell you a good pair of shoes. See what else. I feel like Santa Claus today. Oh, this is a catalog for the Rubin Museum of Art. It's a museum especially of Tibetan and Himalayan art in Manhattan. And these are for everybody. Here there's just one of each item, but these are bookmarkers with an image of the Buddha with the Four Noble Truths on one side, the Eightfold Noble Path on the other side. So whenever you read any book, you'll always be reminded of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Okay, so I will disappear. And then you decide how to divide up the goodies. But the bookmarks are plentiful for everybody.